As we continue our look at some of the select passages in Mark, we come to one of my favorites, which is found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. And I've entitled my talk, Not Lost in the Crowd. One of the events that highlights my failings as a parent happened many years ago when our son Andrew, who was 3 or 4 years old at the time, and I got separated from each other in a large store in the United States. Before I could find him, I heard these words over the public address system. Would the parents of Andrew please come to the customer service desk? As soon as I was reunited with Andrew, he looked at me with accusing eyes and in a quavering voice asked, "Daddy, why did you lose me?" I was fully deserving of his accusation. Really, what he was asking me was, do I matter to you so little that you don't notice me when I'm not there? It was not my finest moment. I suspect, though, that Andrew's question is one we regularly direct at God. God, why did you lose me? Anytime we wonder if God hears our prayers, or anytime we question why anytime we question why bad things happen to us, we can end up assuming that our imperfect faith is not worthy of God's attention. In the Bible passage we look at today, Jesus had just returned from the excursion on which he took his disciples, where they crossed the Sea of Galilee, only to get caught in a life-threatening storm which Jesus miraculously calmed. They had then landed in the region of the Gerasenes, where Jesus cast a legion of demons out of a wild man, who then invaded a herd of 2,000 pigs, causing their drowning demise. I suggested to you, as we considered that whole episode previously, that Jesus allowed his disciples to experience the truth that we can't appreciate the greatness of God unless we have first encountered the greatness of our adversaries. Now, as they returned from their adventure across the Sea of Galilee, they were surrounded by a mass of people, among whom two people in particular were struggling under the weight of overwhelming personal problems. Both of these two people had consulted unsuccessfully with the medical people, and they shared a desperation of viewing Jesus as the last source of help available to them. Apart from those two similarities, they could hardly have been more different, and that makes this, as I said, one of my favorite stories about Jesus. So look for those differences as we read this account from Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, where it says, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, so this is his return after his return journey, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed round him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, Who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So let's consider the differences Mark's account reveals between the two people who sought Jesus' help. The first of the two desperate people was a man named Jairus, and is further identified as the ruler of the synagogue. Reflect for a moment. Of all the people with whom Jesus interacted, how many are actually named? There are a few, like Nicodemus, like Simon the Pharisee, and like this man, Jairus, who are named because they were prominent people. On the other hand, there is the woman at the well, the 10 lepers, a widow and her son, several different blind people, and the woman in this account who are not named because, well, they were too ordinary. In a small city like Capernaum, the ruler of the synagogue was an important person, while the woman's ordinariness shrouded her in anonymity. Besides, she was only a woman in a male-dominated culture. Despite the crowds of people, did Jairus have trouble getting through to Jesus to tell him his problem? Not at all. People instinctively make way for prominent people. The way the story is told, we get the impression that the crowd of people may have been there in support of Jairus, probably anticipating a spectacular miracle on his behalf. But if Jairus was practically thrust in front of Jesus, the woman was shuffled to the periphery of the crowd in an unconscious or maybe a conscious attempt to brush her aside. Not only was Jairus prominent, he had a gripping problem. His young daughter was dying. Few issues in life arouse the human emotion like a suffering child. It's more painful for most parents to see their child sick than to be sick themselves. And it's not only painful for parents. All of us are drawn with compassion to the suffering of children. Undoubtedly, Jesus was also empathetic to the desperate Jairus, and he immediately began to follow Jairus to visit his dying child. But if Jairus had a problem that aroused the sympathy of the most callous individual, the woman's problem was one she did her best to hide. While Jairus was smothered in sympathy, the woman's condition made her unclean, turning her into a social and religious leper. Mark, whose account of this woman's story is more detailed than Matthew and Luke's, tells us that she had spent all her money seeking treatment from doctors who had only managed to worsen her misery. As she was shuffled away from Jesus by his adoring crowd, we sense her personal desperation. How could her embarrassing medical problem possibly compete with that of a sick and dying child? With the differences in the two people threatening to dictate the outcome of the situation, the woman felt her opportunity slipping away. Jesus, followed by a crowd who were eager to witness an exciting miracle, began to accompany Jairus to his house. From the woman's perspective, that's the way it always was. Those with money or position got preferential treatment. Any hope of a private moment with Jesus where she could explain her embarrassing problem was obliterated by the choking crowd of people. And so a thought began to consume her. If only she could touch Jesus' garment. If only for an instant. She believed she would be healed. And so with a strength born of desperation, she pushed and elbowed her way behind Jesus. And for the briefest of moments, as she thrust her hand forward, she felt the fabric of Jesus' robe brush her extended fingers. Instantly, she knew she was healed. Her body felt different. It felt right. She stopped her forward motion, expecting that the crowd would flow past her, abandoning her to her normal state of isolation. To her shock, the crowd stopped with her. Jesus whirled around, and with his gaze settling on her, he asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Afraid on the one hand because her anonymity had been stripped away, but also overcome with gratefulness, the woman fell at Jesus' feet and blurted out her embarrassing story. Jesus, for his part, responded with words that would linger in her ears and warm her heart for the rest of her life. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." It wasn't, of course, the last healing Jesus would perform that day. Jesus would continue on to Jairus' house and raise to life the young daughter who had already died. Jairus' household and the whole community will have celebrated the miraculous healing of his 12-year-old daughter. Meanwhile, a nameless woman who had begun her day under the burden of a devastating stigma returned home whole, her head held high because she was healed. Over the centuries, people have at times criticized the woman and her actions. They have said that it was an act of superstition instead of an act of faith, which led her to touch Jesus' robe. But does God respond to superstition? In fact, Jesus told her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." That said, her faith was far from perfect. Why? She had assumed that her faith was too small for Jesus to notice her. She had failed to grasp that God is incapable of ignoring the smallest expression of faith. Apparently, God feels every bit of power that it takes to help us. Being all powerful, though, does not make God insensitive to the need of the most insignificant. Around Jesus, no one can be lost in the crowd. This event obviously impacted the people who passed on the Gospels to us in the Bible. We might expect that the healing of an anonymous woman in the crowd would have been completely overshadowed by the spectacular raising from the dead of the young girl. Instead, Matthew, Mark, and Luke each remembered her, maybe because they all identified with her. All of us at times feel lost in the crowd, as if our faith is too small. We may mumble our way through a half-hearted prayer, thinking that God will surely not hear our feeble attempt. We may drag ourselves to worship, wondering if there's any point in us being there because our heart is not in it. Or we are tempted to conclude that God doesn't notice us because no great miracle rescues us from a despairing problem. The woman with a problem too embarrassing to talk about would want to remind us that the little bit of faith we manage, the little bit of faith we can muster, will never be lost to God. Our imperfect expressions of faith will not be lost in the crowd.